For the opening lecture that I've prepared for today, what I'd like to start with is the kind of general question of what counts as critical theory today, and then look at some of, and in particular, one of the traditions that's largely been excluded from that, and then use that framework to look very specifically at one of, I think, the most important social phenomena for all of us to try to understand today, and that is fascism, both its deep history and its unbelievable presence in the contemporary world. So if we begin with the question, what counts as critical theory within the dominant globalized academic culture and why? This leads to an additional question of how this very tradition of critical theory has been delimited over time and what it reveals about the dominant cultural and intellectual world, meaning what traditions have been sidelined in this process or systematically excluded for that matter. And what would it mean in the present to try to rejuvenate or reinvent certain elements of critical theory that again have been under assault, as I'll explain in greater detail in a moment. These questions are particularly pressing in a world like the one that we live in, because this world is characterized by unprecedented socioeconomic inequality and environmental destruction. In 2018, the richest 1% of humanity controlled more than half of the world's wealth, while the bottom 80% of humanity had to make do with only 4.5% of this wealth. Right? That's the world that we're living in. We're quite literally, moreover, living in the end times, with the biosphere being eradicated at such a rate that human extinction based on capitalist-driven climate change is a clear and distinct possibility. And in fact, it's already underway for major swaths of the global population that are subjected to various forms of premature death due to lack of food, water, housing, affordable healthcare, etc. In 2017, according to the UN, 6.3 million children and young adolescents died from avoidable causes linked to the socioeconomic and ecological inequalities of the Capitalocene, meaning the era of capitalism, which amounts to one child dying every 5 seconds in our world. So after more than a year of a global health and economic crisis, the stakes of class struggle in theory could not be higher. This is particularly true as we arguably find ourselves in a historical conjuncture where the capitalist ruling class is increasingly turning to fascist, semi-fascist, and authoritarian forms of government. One could point to very quickly Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, Trump in the US, Erdogan in Turkey, Netanyahu in Israel, and the list goes on. So in the presentation that I'll give in 2 weeks, I want to look at the intellectual history of critical theory in the Euro-American world, paying special attention to the legacies of the Frankfurt School and French theory. But for today, I'd like to concentrate very specifically on the intellectual and practical project that serves as the original fount for the Frankfurt School form of critical theory, but which has unfortunately been deformed, marginalized, and excluded from the academy to such an extent that many self-proclaimed critical theorists now embrace the belief that this tradition is passé or quote unquote problematic. Meanwhile, the intellectuals engaging with this tradition, intellectuals like Alexandra Kollontai, Claudia Jones, Ho Chi Minh, George Jackson, Ernesto Che Guevara, have not only been very often prohibited from entering the capitalist academy or seriously studied there, but they have also quite literally been hunted down and killed or imprisoned, as in the case of Che or George Jackson. I'm talking, of course, about the tradition of historical materialism. Now, while it is certainly true that one can encounter this tradition within the globalized Euro-American academy, it is very often the subject of extreme misrepresentations and highbrow ridicule. In fact, it is even taken to be a symbol of intellectual bona fides when one derides its supposed historical determinism and teleology, or its purported preoccupation with so-called white male workers at the expense of women, people of color, etc. Those who actually do take the time to study the tradition of historical materialism, rather than simply parrot this intellectual nonsense are usually trained in the academy to approach historical materialism as simply one discourse amongst others in the idealist game of petty bourgeois intellectual playfulness unmoored from material struggle. In other words, it is presented, if it is at all, as just one of so many other interpretations of the world, rather than a scientific endeavor to provide the most coherent account of the social totality, whose explanatory and transformative power far exceeds that of other discourses. And this is precisely why it is this type of critical theory that I'd like to begin by focusing on, because it's critical theory of the most revolutionary sort. So I'll begin by briefly discussing the power of historical materialism, but then I'd like to turn rather quickly to a case study, which demonstrates the superiority of historical materialism as an explanatory and transformative framework of analysis. So historical materialism, it's important to understand, rejects both empiricism and idealism. It rejects the assumption that there are just brute facts in the world that need to be elucidated, and that those facts are independent of human life, for instance, right? Which would be a kind of banal empiricist position, right? This is what Marx and Engels referred to as simply the collection of dead facts. Historical materialism, though, also rejects idealism. Idealism is the reduction of history to the imagined activity of imagined subjects, to quote Marx and Engels once again, right? It's the assumption that history is driven most fundamentally by ideas, by spiritual forces, by something above and beyond the material power of concrete beings. What this means is that the historical materialism rejects the ontological great divide between a world out there and a mind over here, right? In which empiricism would analyze the world and idealism would presume that the mind or spirit or other such things are the driving forces behind historical developments. On the contrary, via a dialectical apprehension of the world, historical materialists understand that what we call human beings, right, are actually only beings that have historically emerged in a material world of which they are a part, but that they strive to understand, and that their experiences of that world are forged by the deep historicity of their being. The sensuous world, write Marx and Engels, is not a thing given direct from all eternity. Right? The world isn't unchangeable and given. Instead, reading the rest of the quote, it is the product of industry and of the state of society, and indeed a product in the sense that it is an historical product, the result of the activity of a whole succession of generations, right? Its history is made, it's not simply given. In this regard, historical materialism examines real life activity as it has developed over time, and it attempts to forge the most coherent, systematic, and self-reflexive account of it, which requires concrete analysis, conceptualization, and self-critical reflection on one's own material conditions of experience. What this means is that historical materialism is fallibilistic through and through. Fallibilism is a position that maintains that truths that are concocted by human societies are only true to the extent that they have not yet been proven false. And so historical materialism recognizes that any explanatory framework needs to be adapted to ongoing shifting circumstances. And there's no way of understanding the totality of history, including the future, without this ongoing feedback loop in relationship to practical experiences. So historical materialism is a collective process of verification and adjustment. Rather than being a dogmatic doctrine as it's often presented through the ideologies of the dominant academy, historical materialism understands itself to be a historical product, and self-critique is built into its very logic. it's one of the most powerful aspects of the historical materialist tradition, is that instead of eschewing critique and maintaining a dogmatic attachment to principles, it is constantly not only rethinking itself, but testing its claims and its modes of analysis in relationship to the concrete, practical world. Historical materialism, then, to sum up these first two major points, is both a materialist account of history and a historically evolving framework of explanation. A very quick example of that, just to illustrate it, is if you're familiar with Vladimir Lenin's writings on Marx's interpretation of the Paris Commune, one of the things that he highlights is how much Marx's own ideas were changing based on the historical world that he was analyzing. And when he investigated the Paris Commune of the early 1870s, he recognized that there needed to be a vital correction to his work. And that was, in the words of Lenin, the working class cannot simply lay hold of a ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. It needs to smash it. It needs to seize state power and then crush the bourgeois hold on state power, right? So it's a very good example of how Marx himself was continuing to evolve in his own analyses of the world and recognized the centrality and the core importance of seizing state power in the revolutionary project, which of course then Lenin enacted based on this model in the Russian Revolution. Marx, moreover, openly accepted the possibility of multiple paths to socialism, particularly in his correspondence with Russian intellectuals like Elizabeth Dmitriev and Vera Zasulich. As a matter of fact, he emphatically rejected one of the most widespread mischaracterizations of historical materialism. That is the idea that there's a supposed single, determinist, and teleological model for the totality of history. I'd highly recommend that everyone read the Letter on Russia, as it's sometimes referred to, that can be found on Marxist Internet Archive, or any of Marx's other writings on Russia. There's an important book published by Monthly Review Press called Marx and the Russian Road that includes a lot of these writings, and you see it very, very clearly. The last thing that I'd like to say before turning then to the question of fascism is a third major attribute of historical materialism, is that Marx, Engels, Lenin, Ho Chi Minh, and many of the other figures who have contributed to this tradition always insisted on the role of agency in history. If history has been made by human beings and by natural forces, then history can potentially be remade. This leads us then to what I would qualify as the third major factor or aspect of historical materialism that I'd like to identify now. Historical materialism not only develops a materialist account of history that adapts itself to changing times and circumstances, but it also seeks to provide the theoretical coordinates necessary for effectively intervening in history and changing the world. With this in mind, then, I'd like to turn to and basically outline for you a book project that I've been working on for a number of years now that is an attempt to investigate the history of fascism from a historical materialist perspective, with a particular interest in the resurgence of fascist politics in the contemporary historical conjuncture. One of the reasons that I think this is specifically important is because fascism, at least as it emerged and was named within the European context in the interwar period 100 years ago, resembles in extraordinary ways many of the things that we see in our contemporary historical conjuncture, and I'll get into that in a moment. But what I'd like to outline for you today is some of the kind of nodal points in my ongoing research on the topic in order to cull from it a kind of big picture view of the conceptual and methodological contributions of a historical materialist understanding of the world to fleshing out a history of fascism that I would qualify as a kind of counter history of fascism, drawing on the vocabulary of the great Domenico Losordo, who presented a counter history of liberalism, which I would highly, highly recommend if you haven't read it. So one of the key elements in this research for me is understanding that fascism cannot be understood simply as a brute empirical phenomenon, as something that exists in the world like H2O and could be described for all time in terms of its, chemical properties or something along those lines. But that fascism is also not just a set of fixed ideas or a doctrine of a kind of almost metaphysical sort, right? So we cannot take the empiricist route, nor can we take the idealist route. What that requires of us then is a different understanding of how concepts work. And so for my approach to fascism, one of the central starting points is recognizing that fascism is a concept in class struggle, meaning that it is a way of understanding the world that doesn't simply have a unified definition, but itself is the site of class conflict. And in particular, the site of rival ideologies. And as I go through the presentation of these various aspects, you'll recognize that one of the things that I'm pushing back very hard against is the dominant liberal ideology concerning fascism, which assumes a whole series of properties often that I'll get into in a moment. If we begin then instead from the assumption that there's not a generic concept of fascism that could be defined in the kind of intellectual ether for all times, but instead fascism is a social practice that has been defined and debated in various ways, that itself is a site of conflict, we have to recognize then that there are rival conceptualizations or rival ideologies of fascism. One of the reasons that this is important is, and I'll use this vocabulary in a moment, there's a dominant ideology of fascist exceptionalism that tends to oversee a lot of the intellectual debates on fascism. Meaning, people tend to approach the question of fascism with the assumption that fascism is this essential thing that happened in its most kind of core or essential way in Italy and in Germany, but that these were kind of exceptional occurrences that are not part of the larger capitalist world system. I'll come back to this in a moment, but if we begin with the idea of fascism as a concept in class struggle, we can actually begin to tease this out by beginning to look at what is at least the most common understanding or common approach to fascism, and that is, again, beginning with kind of Italy and then looking in Germany. Because in Italy itself, fascism, where the kind of concept was coined, it was not coined as a doctrine. Mussolini explained this very clearly because he said, yeah, we didn't start with a doctrine. What we began with was action and a mode of organizing that was anti-communist, that was pro-capitalist, that was a whole series of other things that I'll get into in a moment, but that was only articulating itself slowly over time, so that within the early fascist party, you actually had a kind of liberal reformist wing and a reactionary right wing to the fascist organizations under Mussolini, and Mussolini himself was straddling these two. Right? So it was not even fascism when it originally emerged, simply the kind of reactionary form of conservative politics that we've become more familiar with in later years. So since its inception, the concept of fascism has been a site of social and ideological struggle. But from the perspective of historical materialism, one of the things that it's important for us to do is not simply say, things are so complicated that we can't map them. It is part of our burden to try to figure out the most coherent working definition of this social phenomenon of fascism and the struggle over it, so that we can gain purchase over it and also some traction in the material world. So one of the things that's important to understand about the early emergence of fascism, again, as it was coined and conceptualized in the restricted and very provincial European context, is that it was a reaction formation to the largest threat to the capitalist system, and that was the success of the Russian Revolution in 1917 that was followed by the failed revolutions across Europe and the Great Depression in the capitalist world. It's within that context of the threat of a new socioeconomic system that was providing universal healthcare, housing, full employment, and maintaining an anti-imperialist position, giving rights to women and empowering women because they weren't just rights, that far, far exceeded anything you saw in bourgeois democracies in the Western world. That was and also taking a position on the colonial question that was anti-colonial through and through, supporting the liberation of colored people and subjugated colonial subjects around the world. The Russian Revolution was an enormous threat to the capitalist world order, and fascism is in part a reaction formation to that threat. But it's a reaction formation to that threat that is also dealing with a very specific socioeconomic situation, and that is what is arguably the most severe and acute crisis of the capitalist world system up to that point in time, right? And one of the ways that you see this is that there were fascist movements in every capitalist country in the wake of the Great Depression. Fascism was not simply operative in Italy and Germany, it was every single capitalist country. What Mussolini and their ilk did, looking at this specific example, is they used mass communications and propaganda to slowly mobilize sectors of civil society, in particular, the petty bourgeoisie, the veterans, the unemployed, sections of the lumpen proletariat, with the enormous backing of big industrial capitalists, right? Fascism, as it emerged, was not simply a grassroots bottom-up movement. It was astroturfed through and through, meaning it was bankrolled by big industrial capital that was interested in creating a radical movement of rejuvenation and renewal that looked to some people like what the Bolsheviks had done, because it was all about rejuvenation and renewal and transformation and radicality and confrontation and other such things. So it took a lot of, or some of the symbology of revolutionary politics, but packaged it in a project that was built and tailored for the capitalist ruling class, because the core of the fascist ideology that was developed by Mussolini and others and extended within Nazi Germany was that it was ultra-nationalist, colonial, and aimed at crushing the workers' movement in order to launch colonial wars of conquest. So at this level of analysis, practically speaking, I think one of the best working definitions of fascism is, to quote Michael Parenti, it's the final solution to class struggle. When the capitalist ruling class is so under threat by the possibility of revolutions in Europe or anywhere else in the world for that matter, its own system is under crisis. They cannot maintain hegemonic rule or rule by consensus. Then resorting to the weapon of last resort becomes the solution. And that's exactly what we saw, of course, in the case of Italy and Germany, was an incredible assault on workers' organizations and socialists and communists and anarchists, who were some of the first who were sent to death camps. Now, it's important, I think, for a conjunctural analysis to highlight these features and to point out that fascism as emerged within this context was not simply the result of ideological features. And so much of the bourgeois concept of fascism tries to reduce fascism to something like a politics of hate, a logic of us and them, rejection of parliamentary democracy, aberrant personalities that can't be controlled, dismissal of science, right? We're probably all familiar with these characteristics because they dominate the liberal press like the New York Times and other such venues. Some of these characteristics might be present at certain times in some of the figures involved, but that's actually missing the point, because the point is that fascism is not first and foremost a bad way of thinking that we could convince someone to avoid embracing. It is a political project of class warfare that is rooted in an economic system, in a material base. And so the liberal concept of fascism tends to be preoccupied with epiphenomenal features rather than examining the social totality. But it's the latter, the social totality, that gives any of these features their real meaning. You know, the aberrant personalities or rejection of science or other such things. In this regard, it's important to recognize that the bourgeois concept of social of fascism also obscures the social totality of the conjuncture within which fascism emerged within Europe, because it displaces what I'll refer to as both the structural and the systemic dimensions of historical materialist analysis. What I mean by that is that I've been talking just very briefly about Italy and a little bit about Germany, but we cannot reduce fascism to this because fascism is actually an outgrowth of a structural crisis of the capitalist world system. So we need to understand that fascism has to be understood at this structural mode of analysis, looking at all of the capitalist countries in the interwar period. And I'll hopefully touch on this later on, or we can come back to it in the Q&A. It's very important that Nazi Germany's racial apartheid, miscegenation laws, and immigration laws were modeled very explicitly on the United States. And that when European fascism rose to power, it was recognized by many within the United States that the black shirts in Italy, for instance, were an Italian version of the KKK, and other fascist organizations within the United States. So we have to understand fascism in terms of this broader politics of the capitalist world system under assault. But we also have to connect. I'm going a little fast here just in the interest of time, but this is what I'd refer to as a multi-scalar materialist analysis, where you look at specific conjunctures, meaning specific space-times, like Italy or Germany or the United States, for instance. These would be the conjunctural level of analysis, but always recognize them as nested within a structural mode of analysis, because all of these are connected through a world system, right? So if you investigate the capitalist world system in the 1930s, you see things like there were fascist movements in every single country, right? And that's the structural mode of analysis. But this also needs to be connected to a systemic mode of analysis. And a systemic mode of analysis doesn't only look at different structural moments in the history of capitalism, but looks at the entire history of capitalism as a world system. This is one of the reasons that internationalism is so key and so important to the historical materialist tradition. Because as authors like Aimé Césaire and Domenico Losordo have argued in great detail, the barbarism of the Nazis or the barbarism of the US police state have to be understood as specific manifestations of the long and deep history of colonial butchery that has brought capitalism to every corner of the globe, right? Césaire, of course, said, oh, we only talk about fascism when there are concentration camps being built in Europe. What about the concentration camps that have been built throughout the history of the colonial expansion of capitalism, right? And we have to see fascism as also rooted in the primitive accumulation and the brutal colonial butchery that has introduced capitalism by force in so many corners of the world. So what the bourgeois concept of fascism attempts to do is to singularize fascism as an idiosyncratic phenomenon that is largely ideological and superstructural, in order to foreclose this historical materialist approach, which looks at its ubiquitous presence within the history of the capitalist world order, and also demonstrates this kind of nested set of relationships that I was just talking about. In this regard, the other element that I want to introduce for the conversation is not just a critique of this ideology of fascist exceptionalism, right? We have to open up the purview of analysis so that when somebody says fascism, you don't just see jackboots and swastikas, you see the American Legion and the KKK and colonial escapades around the world, right? So we need to open that aperture of analysis to a truly internationalist frame. But the other thing that we have to do is deal with the ideology of false antagonisms. And one of the things that's integral to the bourgeois conceptualization of fascism is the development of a false antagonism between liberalism and fascism. By liberalism, I do not mean the political ideology that would be identified with the mildly reformist left, like the Democratic Party in the United States, or kind of democratic parties, or vaguely left-leaning parties within bourgeois democracies. What I mean by liberalism is the political philosophy that began to be developed as early as the 17th century and was really consolidated in the 18th and 19th century, that is a specific form of social order that accompanied the emergence of the capitalist world system and is identified as the dominant ideology of the capitalist world system. That ideology consists in saying that liberal governance, and again, this isn't liberal as opposed to conservative, right? Many conservatives believe in liberal modes of governance. Liberal governance consists in establishing a neutral state apparatus that would oversee the rights and responsibilities of the entire citizenry in an egalitarian fashion, so that private citizens could have their own belief systems, their own ideologies and outlooks, but the state apparatus would be neutral in relationship to those and simply act as the guarantor for rights. The assumption of the bourgeois concept of fascism is that this understanding of liberalism is the great bulwark against fascism, right? So the hashtag resistance in many ways has come to mean that one will go to vote or read the New York Times and that this will save us from fascism, which is the myth, it's one of the dominant myths of our time. If you look at the actual history of political liberalism, this is not at all what has happened. The deep history of political liberalism, of course, is that this grand idea of all men being created free and equal, as it's stated in the Declaration of Independence, went hand in hand with genocidal forms of colonial violence, with the enslavement of major swaths of the population, with the not only disenfranchisement, but the direct super exploitation and oppression of women, on and on and on. Right? So, and these aren't contradictions, right? It's not that these are principles that are good, but that actual reality is more complex. And so we just have to work through these contradictions and improve the system. These forms of super exploitation and oppression are baked into the liberal system of governance. And this we see very clearly in the history of fascism, because there is the widespread myth that people like Mussolini and Hitler orchestrated coup d'etat and took over the apparatus and were violent in the way that one assumes from the point of view of liberal ideology, for instance, that the Bolsheviks were. And they're lumped in to another key ideological concept, that is the ideological concept of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a constructed idea largely driven by the US national security state that supported the work of a number of figures who published important works on totalitarianism, as well as the Foreign Office in Great Britain that supported the work of Hannah Arendt that chose the exact same ideological line. Totalitarianism is a made-up idea that has no real basis in reality, that consists in saying that fascism and communism are basically the same thing, because there are these totalizing enterprises that take over and use the state apparatus to make everybody conform, etc. So the two things that I'd like to identify in this is that liberalism is not a bulwark against fascism, and fascism is the enemy, and always has been the enemy, of communism. And so the concept of totalitarianism is pure ideological pap, right? Otherwise, the fascists wouldn't have killed so many communists, and 27 million communists from the Soviet Union would not have given their lives fighting fascism. So dealing with the first of these issues, fascism in Italy, like in Nazi Germany, rose to power through following the protocols of bourgeois democracies, receiving funding by big industrial capital, to run propaganda campaigns, develop electoral power, and only once that electoral power was consolidated through the role of liberals who aided and abetted the consolidation of power, so much so that they were involved in coalition governments with the Italian fascists, and internationally provided no resistance whatsoever to the global fascist movement. The United States, for instance, and other capitalist countries refused to support the anti-fascist struggle against Franco in Spain. Franco was a self-identified, self-declared fascist, right? There are differences between what he was doing because it was a bit more of a military dictatorship in certain regards, but he claimed himself he was a fascist. And there was not an international organization to support the fight against it. The people who did support the fight against Franco were the communists in the Soviet Union. And so we have to see through the myth of liberalism being the last bulwark to fascism and instead recognize that it has often functioned as the seedbed, the very tolerant seedbed to fascism. I'm just going to jump over a few notes here in the interests of time, because one of the other important factors that I'd like to kind of bring into the discussion and propose for the kind of larger dialogue that we're going to have about this is another thing that the bourgeois account of fascism excludes from analysis is the political economy of actually existing fascism. It is not only large industrialists and bankers, as well as landowners, who funded the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, Mussolini himself was trained by MI5, the national security state in the UK. But US capital played an absolutely central role in the rise of fascism, and in particular, the rise of Nazism. Henry Ford is, of course, one of the great examples because he received the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle, which is the highest honor that could be bestowed upon a non-German. And Mussolini received one the same year as Ford. Ford provided ideological support as an anti-Semite, anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist for the Nazis. The Nazis themselves recognized this, of course. And Ford also provided funding, but he was by far, far from being the only major US capitalist to do this. International Harvester did, General Motors did, Standard Oil, DuPont. And in fact, US foreign investment in Germany increased 48.5% between 1929 and 1940, while declining sharply everywhere else in continental Europe. So fascism is also a strategy of political economy for the maximization of profits via the permanent war economy and colonial endeavors of conquest. It's important, just as a side note, that Hitler very explicitly conceptualized his colonial rampage in the East as being modeled on the American, or I should say US American, colonial rampage in the West. And they understood that the Lebensraum that Hitler and the Germans wanted, or not the Germans, not the German people necessarily, but the Nazis, was a room for colonial expansion, and that the project was to take that away from the greatest threat to the capitalist world system, which was the Bolsheviks in the East, right? So the conquest of the East was a colonial conquest modeled on the Western conquest of the United States. There's great work on this if anybody wants some references, or just read Mein Kampf, where Hitler points out that the US is the model of statecraft that is the most advanced to date and has provided us with the greatest model for what the Third Reich is going to do. In this regard, then, there are maybe 2 or 3 other things that I just want to get on the table in the next 10, 15 minutes, and then I want to open up for discussion. So don't hesitate to begin cogitating on what elements you'd like to engage with. Another very important part of this history is that the ideology of fascist exceptionalism often communicates to us the very false idea that fascism was defeated in World War II due to the US intervention and the shoring up of a liberal world system in which democracy was preserved. Of course, the US refused to enter the war, entered the war very, very late, only on the Western Front, at a point in time at which the Red Army, which all of the capitalist powers had presumed was going to be crushed, and they were giving the green light to that, began marching westward. And in spite of all odds, the communists were defeating the Nazi war machine that was undefeated. As they were marching west, the US decided to enter the war in order to shore up Western Europe against the possibility that the communists would defeat fascism across all of Europe. This is very clear in the fact that Germany deployed 200 divisions in the east and 10 in the west. And the death count in the Soviet Union was 27 million. 400,000 American soldiers gave their lives, which is approximately 1.5% of the Soviet death toll, right? So it is not true that the US Army defeated fascism in World War II. What is true is that the Red Army defeated fascism, and communism, not liberalism, constitutes the last bulwark against fascism. This is a very important historical lesson, in my opinion, because one thing should be clear. You cannot be truly anti-fascist if you don't go to the root of fascism, meaning you need to be anti-capitalist. In that regard, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, and I hope that what I say doesn't sound mildly outlandish, because it has blown my mind in the research that I've been doing over the last decade or so. But I've gone into a kind of deep dive into the history of the US national security state. And one of the things that at first I admit quite naively and ignorantly myself, I was surprised by some of the things that I found. So some of what I say might sound ridiculous and absurd, but it is taken, for the most part, directly from internal documents, testimony from the people involved themselves, and scientifically proven events. And one of the extraordinary things is that in the wake of World War II, and in fact, it even began during World War II, the US national security state was seeking an alliance with part of the Nazi party against Hitler so that they could sign a peace agreement, and the Nazis would have peace in the West so that they could deploy all of their military might against the East. Allen Dulles, the future head of the CIA, who was working for the OSS at that point in time, identified this very clearly. He was one of the people who in Switzerland was having these negotiations with the high command of Nazi Germany, because according to him, and he said this during World War II, the US was fighting the wrong enemy by fighting Nazi Germany. And this was not a minority opinion. He said that the Nazis, this is Allen Dulles, probably, in my opinion, the single most important political figure of the 20th century. The Nazis were pro-capitalist, Aryan Christians. So they should be our friends, right? Because we as Americans, or the US national security state, is pro-capitalist, Aryan, and Christian, whereas the true enemy are the godless communists and their resolute anti-imperialists. Now, what we see then so this already began during World War II, but what we see in the wake of World War II is not a defeat of fascism, but a sub rosa redeployment of fascists and Nazis in the construction of what I've referred to, and I share this article with you if you want to look at it, because I provide some of the documentation within it, a veritable fascist international. I'll give a few examples of this very quickly and then move on to one or two of my last points. The national security state in Germany that was directed against the communists in the Eastern Front was run by Reinhard Gehlen. He was a Nazi general. In the post-war era, was he tried at Nuremberg? Was he incarcerated? No. He was hired, like so many other Nazi officials, by the CIA, brought to the United States, not only trained by the CIA, but brought to Yankee Stadium to see a ball game with the top brass of the US military and national security state, and then put in charge of what's called the Gehlen Organization, which was the nucleus of the German national security state in the post-war era, that hired, according to Erich Lichtblau's assessment, as many as 4,000 Nazi agents who were experts in fighting communism. This is by no means an exception, though, because it was part of a larger operation that's Operation Sunrise that mobilized Nazis and fascists to end the Second World War and begin the Third World War, which was the war of capitalism against communism, which is, of course, the old war that had began in 1918 when the United States and 13 other capitalist countries invaded the Soviet Union in order to, in the words of Winston Churchill, strangle the red babe in its crib. In this regard, a few other examples of this were the extent to which the CIA and other national security state agencies worked to ensure that denazification had an unbelievably limited scope. Quoting the work of Frédéric Charpier, generals, senior officials, policemen, industrialists, lawyers, economists, diplomats, scholars, and real war criminals were spared and put back in their positions. Meanwhile, as many as 10,000 Nazis were allowed to immigrate to the United States in the post-war period, including confirmed Nazis who were part of Hitler's Angels of Death. As many as 1,600 Nazi scientists were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip and were given research jobs at prestigious universities. There were 14 universities that participated in this particular operation, including Cornell, Yale, MIT, and others. This was, of course, only part of a much larger operation that included another operation that I'd encourage you to look into, Operation Gladio, that was a collaboration between CIA and MI6, which is the National Security State Agency for Foreign Affairs in Great Britain. And they set up a secret anti-communist stay-behind army in every country in Western Europe, including all of the neutral countries. These were militant terrorist organizations that were stocked with Nazis and fascists who had been trained in sabotage and destabilization campaigns of various sorts, and the numbers varied depending on the country, a few dozen in certain countries, but as many as several hundred or a few thousand in other countries. And these trained militants were actually mobilized in the strategy of tension, particularly within Italy, but also in Germany and Belgium to a certain extent, although some of this history has not been fully verified. In the case of Italy, it actually went to the higher courts within Italy, and there's a European Parliament resolution on the Gladio stay-behind armies in Italy, where it was found that it was not the communists who were committing acts of terror in the 1960s and early 1970s, but it was these fascist stay-behind organizations that were overseen by the CIA that were committing acts of terrorism against the civilian population in order to drive the voting population into supporting law and order governments and greenlighting extremely draconian crackdowns on communist and socialist organizing. There's a great film, actually a documentary film by the BBC on Operation Gladio I'd recommend, or Daniel Ganser's book, which is the best book on Operation Gladio. And of course, we'd have to deal with the international expansion of these forms of fascism. I'll point very, very quickly to most people, particularly those of you who have spent or come from Latin America, are familiar with the School of the Americas, which has the reputation of having trained the most dictators of any school in the world. But this was part of a much larger operation, an operation that the former CIA agent John Stockwell refers to as the Public Safety Program. This is what Stockwell says, CIA agent John Stockwell. For about 25 years, the CIA trained and organized police and paramilitary officers from around the world in techniques of population control, repression, and torture. Schools were set up in the United States, Panama, and Asia, from which tens of thousands graduated. In some cases, former Nazi officers from Hitler's Third Reich were used as instructors, right? And there are many cases that we could look to and point to. The case of Japan is particularly important because a lot of the top brass in the imperialist army in Japan was not incarcerated after the war, but just as what happened in Germany and in Italy, they were redeployed by the CIA and set up in full power. One of the best examples of this is Nobusuke Kishi, who was known as the devil of Showa because of his brutal oversight on his colonial escapades in Manchukuo, sorry for the mispronunciation, which was a Japanese colony in China. And he was a great admirer of Germany. He was the minister of munitions in Imperial Japan during World War II. And he was actually the person who signed the official declaration of war against the United States, right? So this confirmed fascist, an enemy of the United States, was given generous financial backing and support by the CIA allowed to reconstruct what's referred to as the Liberal Party in Japan. He made that party into a right-wing club of former leaders of Imperial Japan and rose to become Prime Minister of Japan. And to quote the work of Tom Wiener, which in general I wouldn't recommend, but on this front, I think he's correct, the CIA money flowed for at least 15 years to Japan under 4 American presidents, and it helped consolidate one-party rule in Japan for the rest of the Cold War. There are many other examples that I could point to, but I'd like to conclude with a kind of final conceptual framing that, at least for me right now, has been helpful in making sense of this project. And that conceptual framing is in terms of a certain approach to politics that I've identified as the one state, one government paradigm. It's the assumption that when we talk of liberalism or fascism, we should always identify the dominant mode of rule within a particular state, and then describe individual states as either liberal democracies or fascist, for instance. And as you can probably tell from some of the archival research of mine that I've shared with you, when you say that the United States is a liberal democracy, you immediately run into certain contradictions. Like, what about the KKK? What about the racial apartheid system? What about mass incarceration? What about US foreign policy? What about this fascist international that I briefly alluded to? Does it really make sense for us to abide by a one state, one government paradigm? Or does this logic actually shackle us into a particular political geography that invisibilizes the actual modes of governance that are operative? So against the one state, one government paradigm, I've been advocating for, and I should just say one other thing about this. Usually the question then becomes, well, are we going into fascism? Is fascism a threat on the horizon? Is the US going to go through this magical moment where it could go fascist? And it is very important that there's an unbelievable difference, and I'd like to return to this if anyone wants to talk about it, between fascist movements that are, bubbling up, or fascist parties that become prominent, and a full fascist seizure of state power, right? So by saying that liberals have aided and abetted fascists, I do think it's also very important to recognize the differences between them and to live under a form of rule that advocates for liberal democracy while at the same time being involved in clandestine fascistic operations around the world is different than living in a country, for instance, that would be an open fascist dictatorship, right? And this is, I would say, also extremely important to avoid a kind of ultra leftist confusion in which liberalism and fascism are just smashed together and they're the exact same thing, right? So I'd just like to say that as a kind of proviso in passing that I'd be more than happy to return to in our discussion. But this kind of final point that I'd like to highlight is multiple modes of governance as a way of developing a more complex historical materialist account of politics. So that instead of assuming that there's just one state and it has one form of rule, looking at how states actually function in terms of different modes of governance that target specific populations at various points in time. For instance, when the young Emmett Till, the 14-year-old boy, was brutally tortured and lynched in the South of the United States, to say that that boy lived under a liberal democracy in which he had rights, I think is a complete illusion. To recognize, though, that the US has functioned in terms of a symbology of liberal governance, undergirded by fascistic modes of targeting racialized and colonial subjects, either for elimination, mass incarceration, or general terror, allows us to see, to get out of the perception management of the one state, one government paradigm. And it also allows us to recognize that foreign policy has to be taken into account in the analysis of any political dynamic whatsoever. And so that the United States not only support, but being the driving force behind global imperialism in the world today, needs to be understood as part of our analysis of fascism. And so I'll leave you with a final way of understanding if we do take seriously these multiple modes of governance, how we can see liberalism and fascism not simply operating as the kind of liberalism as the last bulwark of rights against fascism, but sometimes, in many cases, functioning in terms of the kind of good cop, bad cop logic in which they are serving the same basic masters. And that is the capitalist ruling class. What I mean by that, if you've ever been interrogated, I have not been subjected, other than in my own social interactions, to a kind of good cop, bad cop routine under police interrogation. But my understanding of it is that one officer will play the role, they're both serving the same social function, but one of them will be brutal, aggressive, and take the glove off, whereas the other will come back in after having beaten a victim and say, oh, that cop is so mean, he beats everybody, he's like a real bad apple, but come on, just tell me some information and I'll watch out for you and we'll give you a adequate trial, whatever else it might be, right? So the good cop is akin to this kind of liberal mode of rule in which we're going to respect your rights, whereas the bad cop is gloves off, we're just going to beat you into submission. But what's really important to recognize is that the only way the good cop, bad cop logic is successful is if it creates an ideological dividing line in the mind of the victim who thinks that the good cop actually has their best interest in mind and doesn't recognize that they are both cops to the capitalist system. One is trying to, and I'll close, this is a little bit of a simplistic condensation, but it allows us at least to see something. One attempts to rule us with the baton, right? With the club of submission. The other tries to rule us, in Gramscian terms, hegemonic, through consent, by convincing us that we should behave in certain ways. And we have to recognize that liberalism and fascism have often operated in precisely this way in order to give us both the intellectual and the practical tools for developing a real struggle against fascism, which is going to the roots of the fascist project, which is the capitalist world system, and the need to enforce the extreme forms of socioeconomic inequality that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And I will wrap up there and encourage everyone to use the raise hand function in order to make any contributions that you would like. And we can also take a moment for people to have a sip of coffee or drink a glass of water and collect their thoughts, or run to the bathroom or whatever else we might need. But the floor is open, including to obviously Jared, Constanza, and Jennifer, if anyone wants to jump in.
Emiliano.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Gabriel, for that. That was great. It actually brought to mind, I've been reading a lot of Lo Zurdo and been on a Lo Zurdo joyride, which has been very stimulating to my brain. There are certain paths that were closed, or that there were certain elements in which I realized I've been confused about the actual history of how this process of demarxification of the interpretation of history has happened in all the different realms of culture, politics, the economy. And when I was listening to the analysis on the way in which fascism operates in Latin America, it reminded me of a contradiction that I always had when I thought about Colonia Dignidad, which was this fascist enclave in the middle of the Pinochet dictatorship, in which you had actual German ex-Nazi soldiers who were torturing children and doing experiments, collaborating with the Chilean secret police, which in turn had been trained by the CIA, and it was coordinated with the CIA in terms of Plan Condor. And so it's interesting because all of these things during the 90s, I remember, were presented as struggles within this liberal state, the new concertación, the new social democratic governments were presented as opposed to this project. But in reality, what you had is that the CIA was successful in implementing an economic model, the neoliberal economic model in Chile, precisely because of the collaboration that they had with these Nazi groups that were kind of the instrument of last resort, right? So for example, in Chile, when the secret police, the CNI or the DINA, did not want to directly torture Marxists and communists, they will outsource the torturing to the Colonia Dignidad so that they could actually create this space outside of history in a way, because it was not directly tied to the fascist state and it was not directly tied to the CIA, but in a very real way, it was an expression of CIA policy in Latin America. So when I was listening to that, it just brought to mind how in some ways during the 90s, I feel like we went through this hallucination in which we lost the connection with our own history as Marxists, right? We lost connection with the history of how significant the defeat of the Nazis was in terms of how, you know, a very humble revolution, a revolution with very humble origins, was able to mount this counteroffensive against the biggest, death machine ever invented. And I think that's a history that we're still kind of trapped, and even in many circles that define themselves as Marxist, I see that there is a tendency to shy away from the conversations about the actual role that the Soviet Union had in not only defeating the Nazis, but also in creating a counterweight to the world that, to a world which would have been so much worse had the Russians and the Soviets not triumphed and achieved whatever they were able to achieve. So yeah, I was just, in terms of that reflection, I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about how that process that happened during the 90s, right, kind of changed what you refer to as the Imperial Academy, became completely colonized. But even in the places where, Marxist critical theory and cultural theory workers adopted kind of irreflexively all of this ideology, this rejection of the project of Marx, the idea that another world is possible, the idea that when people come together, they can change the world, and how the Black Legend, or what you refer to as the Gulag blackmail, I think, has actually become dominant in most of the left in terms of discounting any possibility of a collective project of social transformation. And I'll leave it there because there's more, but
That's a great way to start out, Emiliano, and thank you for that rich intervention. I would love if you could share with me the best resources that you've read on the kind of secret service or the militant organization overseen by the CIA in Chile, because I don't know that much about that specifically, but I definitely want to read more on it. So please follow up if you have good work on that. That does, just the kind of addressing that first and then getting more onto your question, the part of the internationalization of fascism that occurred in the wake of World War II, of which Chile is one manifestation, was the establishment of rat lines from Europe, largely to Latin America. The Vatican was involved in this project and the CIA oversaw it. And the number of Nazis and fascists who were directly funneled into the then dictatorships and various authoritarian regimes in Latin America and Operation Condor is quite extraordinary. And they were some of the most brutal of the Nazis and fascists. Klaus Barbie stands out for his involvement in Bolivia. There's a lot of other examples that we could point to. So thank you for highlighting that, because that's also another really important thing about the internationalist perspective and the ways in which certain forms of academic training don't allow us to see things. Because there are a lot of historians who are specialists in Nazi Germany and don't know anything about Latin America and frankly don't care about it, or vice versa, you know. And so that not only the Eurocentrism, but the kind of geography that we're trained in doesn't allow for these larger transnational analyses. And on that front, another aspect of this is being able to analyze the state apparatus, not only in terms of what the state tells us it's doing, but also what the state does clandestinely and under the radar, right? Because so much of the history that we've been taught is a history of what state operators have done and how they've narrated that history themselves. It's what Jennifer and I've referred to in our own work as the aesthetics of power, right? It's the ruling class or a particular state apparatus that produces an image of itself, and that is given to us as history. And in that regard, also, political economy is often cut off from these clandestine state forces. So one has an understanding of the capitalist world system as just economics and the flow of money and other such things, and doesn't recognize, as you pointed out quite cogently, the neoliberal project, to highlight that, is driven by these very authoritarian coup d'etat, as in the case of Chile, in order to impose particular economic regimes. This is not a free market. This isn't people choosing. There's nothing about freedom going on here. These are brutal, brutal destructions of human civilization in the name of profit. So that all has to be highlighted. And I just wanted to tease that out from some of what you said. But speaking more poignantly to what you highlighted, the turn away from not only historical materialism, but more generally actually existing socialism is, of course, one of the major characteristics of the Western intelligentsia. And I'm going to look very explicitly in the next lecture that I'm going to give in, I think, 2 weeks. But just at least highlighting a few things in that regard, this history goes very far back, of course, right? So it's not just the 1990s. You can go back to the Palmer raids in 1919 and 1920, when the US government was illegally rounding up tens of thousands of socialists, anarchists, and communists, and either imprisoning them, deporting them, and other such things. And the assault on the radical intellectual traditions within the United States has been truly awesome, because some of the most significant intellectuals in the 20th century have either been killed, incarcerated, forced to live in exile. There's so many examples that we could point to. Assata Shakur, and I mentioned Claudia Jones before, and there's so many others that we could point to. So it's just to say that there's a deeper history to that. But in the contemporary moment, of course, it is kind of given as a unquestioned doxa that everything that happened in the Soviet Union was this totalitarian horror, and we have to reinvent everything new and think differently and develop different discourses and other such things. And unfortunately, this line is proffered by people who have never seriously studied any of the things that they're talking about. So they have no argued and materially grounded critiques of the Soviet Union or of China or of other such, Venezuela, Cuba, you could point to a lot of examples. So it's an anti-communism that is devoid of material proof, right? And it's embedded as well in this kind of blackmail of the gulag and the assumption that, well, these things might have been good in theory, but in practice, the fact that millions of people were taken out of a feudal society and provided with education, jobs, women were enfranchised, all of that is actually just a horrific occurrence because it was a threat to the capitalist ruling class. And so we have to raise the larger question of the value system by which we judge something. The Soviet Union was very, very bad for the capitalist ruling class, right? That is clear. And maybe a final thing that I'd say is, were there mistakes made along the way? Are there things that Marxists should be, have been, and continue to be critical of in ways that actually engage with those projects? Absolutely. Is there a dogmatic embrace of everything that's happened under the name of socialism? Of course not. but you have to be involved in and contribute to that struggle of producing an alternative world, instead of having your beginning point be a reflexive anti-communism that is ignorant, combined with a complete lack of knowledge of actually existing socialism. That means that you're an intellectual supporter for a capitalist system that is oppressing and exploiting not only you, but the masses of humanity. But I'll turn it over. I don't know if Jennifer, if you were moderating or I was, if you want to jump in, or
Oh, yeah.
Mara, either one.
I wanted to jump in. I wanted to mention one thing and then share a question that Tassin shared with me for you. I just wanted to say about Emiliano's question about certain things, what happens in the 90s. I just wanted to briefly mention like the rise of the kind of the hegemony of human rights discourse in the 90s as a way of interpreting that history of memory studies as a way of and also as a kind of one of the vectors of rewriting a history of anti-communist, of a struggle between capital and labor as a struggle of democracy against authoritarianism, and the kind of fetishization that we see of democracy as a, and not even a substantial democracy you see in the 90s that totally supplants a kind of discussion of anti-capitalist struggle. That you see that in the intelligentsia, not only in the US, but also in Latin America. Now, Tassin shared a question for you, Gabriel, and which is, and I'm sorry if I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I want to ask if the current moment of the rise and consolidation of authoritarian rulers in many countries of the world is a recontinuation or the beginning of the internationalization of fascism.
That's a great question. And we could spend the whole workshop trying to unpack it, and maybe we should, because it's going to have and already does have a material impact on so many of our lives. Very quickly, I would say that when you look at what happened in the interwar period in Europe and why the capitalist ruling class both turned to the fascist solution and was able to mobilize large sections of the disenfranchised and exploited population in that project, right? These were poor and destitute people who were brought on board for that project, for the most part, as the foot soldiers. And that when you look at that context, either poor and destitute or those who felt under threat, you look at that context and you compare it to what's going on in the early 21st century, you have a severe and acute capitalist crisis that, of course, capitalism goes through periodic crises, but the one in 2008, according to at least the best political economists that I've read, was never fully resolved. It was just kind of punted down the field. And in the words of William I. Robinson, somebody whose work I'd highly recommend to everyone on the call, that what happened with the coronavirus pandemic is that the fuse of this time bomb of the economic crisis of 2008 and 9 was lit. And so we're now seeing, the extreme forms of, you see the homelessness and just even within the US context, but this is a global phenomenon, the capitalist world system is in extreme crisis. And I'd highly recommend the work of the Tricontinental that has looked explicitly at the relationship between socialist governments and their response to the COVID crisis and capitalist countries and their response to the crisis, right? Because under socialism, one of the key elements is free and affordable healthcare to all, right? Under capitalism, one of the main principles is profit, profit, profit at the expense of everyone. And so the healthcare response has been not only despicable and deplorable within the capitalist system, but there's been endless profiteering and other such things. And so we're looking at more extreme forms of polarization than, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And of course, last summer, you saw this in the very insurgent kind of largely Black proletarian uprisings within the United States and more generally. And so in that context, the fascist solution becomes one that needs to be on the table and is very clearly on the table for so many people around the world. But one of the big differences is that global socialist and communist organizing is at a very different state than it was in the 1930s, right? And so we don't have the Third International. We don't have actually existing socialism in the Soviet Union. We have an emergent Chinese economy, obviously. We have China, which was born of a socialist revolution, but there are obviously very capitalist elements in what Mao and others refer to as the capitalist rotors taking over part of the Chinese apparatus. And we have an attempt on the part of so many people to get plugged into socialist organizing in new and interesting ways, but the level of maturity is very limited. So according to recent stats, as many as 70% of millennials in the United States support socialism and 30% identify as communists. It's very different than 10 years ago, right? But it's not the Communist International. So we're at a stage of class struggle in which the capitalist ruling class has succeeded, unfortunately, in not only demolishing eventually and opening up to capitalist pilfering the Soviet Union, but has also waged an intellectual world war against the very idea of socialism. And this has been an enormous impediment to our organizing endeavors and to building power. It's one of the reasons that a lot of the research that I've been talking about is part of a book that I refer to as the intellectual world war, and that's the war on the minds of people and the ability to think and implement a different socioeconomic system. So I know that that is too short, but I see the other hands and want to get onto them. So I'm sure we can come back to this, and don't hesitate, Tassin, to follow up and continue this conversation in the other sessions. But Mara, we should turn the floor over to you.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't think I have the best connection. So if it cuts out, just let me know. But I guess, I've conceptualized fascism in the past as like an outgrowth of the worst tendencies of capitalism. If you let capitalism, you let poverty, you let inequality, you let homelessness get to such a bad point, it will like lead to an unsatisfied part of the population to almost find like a false culprit to what's going on and say, oh, it's immigrants, or oh, it's the Jews, and blame this as a reason instead of actually capitalism and this economic order. And so I'm wondering if this view of capitalism is compatible with the view that this view of fascism is compatible with fascism also as a response to stopping communism. And maybe if, in trying to stop communism, the capitalist government, uses this, marginalized part of the population that is unsatisfied with capitalism and uses this fascist ideology to mobilize them.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you outline is very coherent, and that capitalist crisis is one of the driving forces behind the intensification of fascist and semi-fascist politics. It does not mean that fascist organizing is not going on the daily. We have a number of fascist organizations in the US, there's tons of them in Europe and Latin America and elsewhere, right? But that one of the important things, and I think you did a good job of identifying this, is it's also, you have to look at the point of view, not just of the ideological capture of particular subjects, but also at the resources that are being deployed in order to operate or to undertake that capture. Meaning that the capitalist ruling class that controls the means of production, but also the means of cultural production and the means of communication, right? There are 5 mega corporations that control 85% of what all Americans see and hear. Just to give you an idea of how easy mind management is in the contemporary world system. And if you decide to use that in that capacity, it has truly awesome power. But another element that you pointed out is that the reaction formation to communism was and continues to be very, very important. But in certain reactionary contexts like the United States, communism has sometimes been redefined as social democracy or even vaguely left-leaning social projects that would be identified even with the Democratic Party. So I just finished writing an article on the fascist coup d'etat that was planned in the United States in 1934. And it's a fantastic case study of what this looks like, because it was Morgan and DuPont and the finance capital in the United States that hired a gentleman to go and study, spent 4 months studying all the fascist organizations in the United States in order to report back on the best model to be implemented within the US. Identified the Croix de Feu in France, a fascist organization in France, as the best model. And they were going to hire a general to mobilize an army of 500,000 veterans to march on Washington and force Roosevelt to accept this general as an administrator, and then sideline him like the King of Italy as just a symbolic figurehead, and then roll back the New Deal, right? And this particular project, which unfortunately almost nobody knows about, this attempted fascist coup d'etat, is a really good example, I think, and hopefully, Mara, correct me if I'm not speaking enough to your point, is that in this case, it's not actually really anti-communist. It's a redefinition of what the communist threat looks like in a reactionary political culture like the United States, where the New Deal would be considered a stepping stone towards communism, even though the New Deal was being criticized severely by communists for not being, in the interest of the working people enough. Mara, does that, sorry, you just jumped around on my screen. Did I address your point though, or were you trying to get at something else?
No, that addresses my point. Thank you.
Okay. Constanza, I'm not sure who was next, but Constanza?
I'm not sure if I'm next. I think Daniel was before me.
Okay, that's it. Daniel?
Hey, thanks. I also have some connectivity issues, so if I get lost, just let me know. I was wondering about, well, first of all, thanks for your presentation. I mean, it's brilliant. I just was wondering if what's your take on what happens with like the humanitarian perspective, or the humanitarian take that or focus that the fascism regimes use and utilize to enter into Latin America, and how, I mean, like I'm from Mexico, and I work really close with indigenous communities here in Mexico. So there seems to be like a known thing that the USA, for instance, it's one of the mechanisms of neocolonialism, and how they got pretty much like away with getting into the communities and just getting information. And I don't know, I being an activist and being a person who's really involved in those kind of scenarios, I'm appalled by how, for instance, USA, but I'm pretty sure that you know about many other mechanisms in which and that's my actual question. Like, what's your take on that? So how like the human rights agenda, and how specifically those humanitarian organizations are trying to get information, and again, like us activists, we need the money, we need the resources, so what to continue our work. So a little bit of that tension. What's your take on that tension? And of course, I'm always more on the autonomy line. So yeah, well, either way, thanks.
Just to understand the question, it's about the kind of logic of humanitarian interventions and how they might sound good, but are often just weapons of imperialism? Exactly.
And if you could point out a few examples of organizations that today, because the confusion that I've heard a lot is that, the USA was bad, like back in the day. And I don't know, like I just feel again appalled by that idea. Like for me, it does not make sense to think that a huge organization just changed their mind and now they're good and now they're helping people out. So like, could you give some examples that I might not be aware of on how this strategy takes place?
Absolutely. I might, in 1 second, punt that question to Jennifer Ponce de Leon in the name of collective intellectual endeavors, because she not only knows a lot more about it myself, but has published a recent book that we'll be talking about in the workshop that deals a lot with these questions of humanitarian interventions. Maybe the only thing that I would say very quickly is that the work of William Bloom, I would highly recommend, particularly Killing Hope. It's the book that goes through and details in a case-by-case scenario, the US's involvement in endeavoring to overthrow 50 foreign governments since World War II, the majority of which were democratically elected, and this has unabated. Look at Venezuela, look at the draconian blockade around Cuba, look at the buildup to war in China. You know, the examples are kind of endless, but it also systematically interferes with so many democratic elections around the world. There are at least 30 cases of elections that have been, you know, attested to where it's clear that the US national security state has been involved in meddling, but I'm sure there's many, many more. They've attempted to assassinate some 50 foreign leaders over time, and this is again an ongoing project, drop bombs on 30 countries. And so we have to, you know, stop drinking the Kool-Aid and recognize that the world that we're living in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., is a world in which the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Jennifer, could I call on you though to address that question more specifically?
Yeah, I think I would just, you know, to speak more specifically to the question of kind of the humanitarian, liberal humanitarianism that is promoted via the kind of international human rights regime. And I think that, you know, when we think of kind of, you know, human rights is really, you know, explicitly used as a kind of cover for imperialist intervention, very, you know, the 90s and forward. And I think we really see that with, you know, as a cover against, as you said, sanctions against Venezuela. It was used, you know, even with the coup in Bolivia. It's a kind of, you know, constantly trotted out. You could probably even remember there were like human, I mean, the concerts in the names of human rights in backing coup attempts, et cetera, that we've seen just in recent years. But I also just wanted to mention a kind of the longer history of the, you know, liberal human rights regime has been one, I think can be understood as a kind of counter-revolutionary and anti-colonial force. This is an argument that has been, you know, developed really beautifully by people like Randall Williams in his study of human rights and its violence, a book called Divided World, Human Rights and Its Violence, Robert Meister's work on human rights. And on one hand, you have it really, and what some of the things they outline is the kind of human rights being formulated at a same time where you have, you know, in the wake of World War II, competing anti-colonial internationalisms, right? And so also understanding that it is adopted as a form of liberal internationalism over and against these other extant forms of internationalism that are actually explicitly arguing for, you know, the emancipation of colonized people. And that in fact, the way that the human rights regime proscribes, you know, and prohibits and sanctions counter violence by the oppressed is one really great example of the way that it itself, you know, has not just, you know, in the 90s, but even much earlier, lent itself to an imperialist project. As well as, you know, if we understand that it is something that has kind of enshrined the power of international law as being, you know, supposedly a bulwark against imperialism, when international law itself is a weapon of imperialism. This is an argument China Miéville makes in his Marxist study of international law. Many people know him more as a fiction writer, but he also wrote Marxist study of international law. And then moreover, if you think of when human rights really kind of you know, though it's formulated in the wake of World War II, it kind of attains this sort of hegemonic position globally in the 70s. And that's when you have Amnesty International really becoming very powerful. And this is also the time when, you know, what it's offering is a kind of defensive politics of the protection of individual rights, as opposed to something like, you know, a politics of collective struggle against exploitation and oppression. And in the context of, say, Latin America, a lot of leftists adopt the language of human rights in a kind of purely defensive position because of the, you know, incredibly violent assault on the left that's happening. But there are a lot of studies, you know, even of specifically like the decisions that people make in doing that and having to couch their appeals, you know, within that language of human rights, which demands that they, for example, erase any history of militancy from those subjects who are supposed to, for them to be proper subjects of human rights who could appeal for international protections. They can't be militants who might actually engage in an armed struggle. You know, there was this famous case, just also, for example, this is not about Latin America, of, you know, Amnesty International not recognizing Nelson Mandela as a proper subject, as a prisoner of conscience, because he, you know, said that, you know, armed defense, you know, and counter violence was acceptable. And that this also becomes kind of the way that it then becomes the kind of, finally, I guess just the last point I want to say is that there's also this argument, this is something that Robert Meister makes, I think, very beautifully, that when he describes it, he describes human rights and the kind of humanitarian logic that it enshrines as kind of counter-revolutionary project by other means, because of the way that it really narrows the focus on who are the victims of human rights abuses, which are oftentimes more visible figures, but also people who have been subjected to kind of individual violence on their person. Then we don't see that usually that type of violence is a means to a much broader project, like, you know, the radicalization of exploitation, the immiseration of the working class, which of course entails all kinds of violence that can't be recognized within the human rights framework, right? So it really narrows the scope of who the victims are, but it also allows the beneficiaries of that violence to maintain all of the benefits that they accrued through that violence, because that larger structural projects for which that violence is deployed are obfuscated by the human rights framework.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was much better than I would have been able to do myself. So Constanza, would you like to, and I'll put a call out for any last questions. This might be the last one unless somebody wants to jump on.
Okay, so thank you, Gabriel. While I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking that it is important to highlight that historical materialism and really the communist movement has systematically studied fascism, and it has provided a materialist account of fascism, trying to understand the political projects of fascism, but also considering the consequences of that characterization for revolutionary tactic and strategy. And on that regard, and this is in pamphlets that we could read for today, the rise of fascism provoked a debate in the communist movement around the tactic of the United Front. This was a historical debate on the tactic of unity between progressive and revolutionary forces to face fascism in the 30s and in the 20s. So at this point, I was wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the strategic and the tactical significance of considering aspects of the current conjuncture in terms of fascism, or as you have said, fascistic modes of targeting certain populations.
That's a great question. And again, we should probably collectively spend some time trying to unpack that question that is going to exceed the little Q&A exchange that we have here. But of course, you're absolutely right that within the Communist International, there was a kind of ongoing debate that ended up kind of being settled in 1933, and then it became part of the Seventh World Congress. And there was a presentation by Dimitrov, of whom I shared with you the text that he wrote on American fascism. And Dimitrov understood fascism as the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinist, and most imperialist elements of finance capital, and maintained that what we needed to do in order to successfully struggle against capitalism is embrace a tactic of not only a united front, but a popular front. And there's a number of kind of background issues that one would need to be familiar with in this regard, but in a nutshell, and this overlaps with part of what Emiliano highlighted earlier, is that in the early 20th century, some of the social democrats, which are not, history has changed quite a bit, but a social democrat in Europe, and particularly in Germany in the 1930s, was basically a reformist Marxist who identified with the Second International. So this is far to the left of Bernie Sanders, but still to the right of the Bolsheviks. And they took a position, the Social Democrats, that was actually against the revolutionary seizure of power within Germany. And so the Comintern early on had decided that the Social Democrats, the reformist Marxists, and some of them were very progressive liberals, were actually aiding and abetting fascism so much that they should be identified as social fascists, and that we should struggle against them just as much as against the fascists. What this led to was an internal critique of the Comintern, in which Dimitrov's position ended up rising to prominence. And I just give you this little bit of background so you understand the difference between a united and a popular front. A united front is when the anti-capitalist parties get together and say, we're going to form a united bloc against the rise of fascism. A popular front, which Dimitrov was advocating for and became the policy of the Comintern in the mid-1930s, was we're going to extend this to a popular front because the situation is so bad that we need to work with the liberals, the reformists, and everybody needs to recognize that the fascists will not only kill communists, they'll also kill liberals. And that extension of that project, which some have argued was too slow in getting off the ground, could have been quicker, et cetera, was one of, I think, the most coherent tactics at that point in time. But it also had extreme consequences for the world communist movement because it meant that the fight against fascism was identified as the primary contradiction of global class struggle, rather than the revolutionary overthrow of capitalist governments. And so, and again, this would be very complex to unpack, but what was coming out from the Comintern was, communist parties in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, elsewhere, should not be trying to overthrow governments at this point in time. The actuality of revolution was actually off the agenda. And this is also one of the reasons that when the Cuban Revolution came out in 1959, it was actually breaking quite explicitly with and demonstrating in Latin America what a revolutionary, politics would look like. All of that to say that the question of tactics and strategies always has to be embedded in very specific historical conjunctures. And in looking back at that and attempting to address maybe more directly the core of your question, we have to be thinking today, well, what is the nature of this threat? What is the current state of class struggle? And what is the most coherent tactic and strategy for struggling against it? The strategy, I think, as socialists, revolutionary socialists have always identified, is the same. You will only get rid of fascism by abolishing the capitalist system, because fascism is a symptom of capitalism. And if we lose sight of that, then we can skid off course into a whole series of other either ultra-leftist ideologies or liberal ideologies and whatnot. The question of tactics, I think, is very difficult in this moment. Should we be forming a united front right now in the United States or internationally? Should we be forming a popular front at this point? In my own organizing, the questions and conversations that I'm part of, these are live issues. And obviously they're not issues that would be decided by me on a Zoom call or you or anybody else. They're decided through collective class struggle. My sense of at least where my organizing is centered, which is from an internationalist perspective, but based in the United States at this point, is that the situation is such within the US context that some of the organizations, at least that I work with, have maintained that we're not at the point where a united or popular front within the US context actually makes sense, because part of the Trump phenomena, and this is more my own personal views on this, was paving the way for Biden to bring in a right-wing Democrat who is going to then implement and continue many of the policies that were going on under Trump, break an innumerable number of campaign promises, but under the flag of, well, it's not fascism, or, oh, it's not Trump. And that the capitalist ruling class, you saw this prior to the uprising of January 6th and the kind of very strange series of events that came together then, both the capitalist ruling class, the US national security state, and a lot of the top brass of the military had already aligned themselves on Biden. I think that that is important because, and this also has to do with the deeper history of the United States, it's been identified that hegemonic rule through consensus, is still one of the most powerful forms of governance operative in the United States. And from the point of view of the capitalist ruling class, it's a cost-benefit analysis. There's no moral question, right? For capitalists, there is no morality. What there is an analysis of a cost-benefit relationship. If you can keep the population sedated through its, the culture industry, unplugged from socialist organizing, defeated, dissolute, atomized, and disconnected, and at best they might think that socialism looks good on paper but is impossible, then you've managed their minds, and that's much easier and at a lot of levels than an overt turn towards fascism. In that regard, that doesn't mean that fascist organizing isn't continuing, that fascist violence, particularly against colonial subjects and international, isn't going on unabated, but that tactically, it might not make sense within certain organizations in the United States to say, okay, we're going to work with the Democratic Party or the DSA because Trump is such a threat that it would be like a fascist seizure of power if he was in office. Well, in fact, he was in office, right? And he continued a lot of the same policies that were operative under Obama. Some things were worse. Some things arguably actually were slightly better. So you need a fine-grained materialist analysis of what was going on in the situation. That also doesn't then engage more generally with the international situation, right? Would also have to be part of that question. In this regard, maybe I'll just wrap up there, because again, this is a question that we should continue to unpack for years probably to come. The Black Panther Party of the United States was interested in, and they marshaled and organized a united front against racist police violence and US imperialism in the late 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, early 1970s. And so it is an interesting historical example that I've been exploring of a Marxist-Leninist party within the United States that did decide that a united front policy, it wasn't a popular front, it was a united front policy, and as well combined with the organization of militant armed forms of self-defense of particularly Black proletarian and lumpen proletarian communities, right? And so it's not just that we have to decide, oh, united front or popular front, there's a lot of other modes of organizing, and that might be a really interesting example to look at, as well as what George Jackson refers to as the development of the revolutionary commune, which meant the organizations that I've been involved with are doing precisely that, meaning revolutionary organizing in a grassroots organization that brings in the working class into a project of both re-education and empowerment in order to begin to build the power that's necessary to actually be able to fight fascism and ultimately capitalism and win, as opposed to jumping into a fight that we wouldn't be able to win because the state of class struggle isn't there yet. I don't know if Constanza, if there's things more specific that you wanted to come back at me with or think about, but we're good for now. Then maybe Nico, because we're almost arriving at 2 hours. Maybe Nico, you'll have the last question comment.
Great, thank you. And then I want to thank you, Gabriel, for your introductory lecture, and everyone else for your contributions and questions. So something that I was struck by in the introduction of one of the pieces that we were sent was, and that seems very relevant today, is like the extreme importance of like American fascism in an international context in its relation to other fascist movements internationally. And for example, I didn't know the extent to which that you mentioned in the beginning, for example, the role that American interests had in like the rise of fascist movements in the 1930s. But I'm also very struck by, like, today, for example, the extreme degree of like cooperation and dialogue between fascist movements and right-wing movements internationally, right? Like Hungary, Brazil, France, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was wondering what you thought, besides the sort of obvious technological facility of communication, what the reason the factors are contributing to this sort of increased like syncing up of disparate fascist movements around the world, and sort of what the barriers have been in terms of establishing sort of an analogous international synchronization between left-wing movements.
as a starting point, and this actually is echoing back to Mara's intervention, because I thought that this might be helpful for framing this, because one of the things that's very powerful about certain forms of fascist ideology, and that's one of the reasons that I think that it is kind of more on the agenda in the contemporary conjuncture, is that it puts forth an ideological gestalt, right? And gestalt is just a form, right? And a form that makes sense of certain factual elements from reality. If you're familiar with the duck rabbit image, this famous image that you know, it looks like a duck and then you can see a rabbit in it, but the image itself is identical. It's, for me, a perfect aesthetic manifestation of an ideological gestalt, right? Nothing changes in material reality, but you can see it as a rabbit or you can see it as a duck. And a fascist ideological gestalt, particularly the one that's been cultivated for the contemporary moment, is one in which there are facts of this world that people are being subjected to that they need an explanation for. Why don't I have healthcare? Why is my uncle in prison? Why are bombs dropping overhead? There are, you know, extreme situations that people need an explanation. Why did I lose my job? Why do I have no pension? Why do I wake up in the middle of the night and think I will never retire? All of these things are part of a reality that, in the words of Michael Parenti, is radical. People are constantly confronting a reality in which their material needs are not being met. And an ideological gestalt takes those elements of reality and reframes them in such a way that they appear to give an explanation of the reality of working people. So that, as Mara was alluding to, well, the reason I don't have a job is because the Mexicans stole my job, or the reason I don't have a pension is because there's a few big fat cats who did this, as opposed to a structural system that is making sure to take every ounce of labor power from every person until they die. In that regard, this ideological gestalt has been kind of shored up and is being proffered and put forth and has just gone through different iterations, right? You can trace it back to the rampant Islamophobia in the wake of 2001 and other such forms, and has also become consolidated by a global communications industry that is more centralized and more controlled than it ever has been in history. In the history of the US national security state that I've been investigating, they have a word for this that was developed by Frank Wisner. He referred to as the global communications network, which includes everything, right? Radio, painting, music, education, newspapers, obviously, TV, all of it, internet. All of that is what he referred to as the mighty Wurlitzer. And the CIA and national security state operatives have taken control, to a large extent, of that entire network, literally having hundreds of journalists around the world controlling and owning press outlets around the world. And a Wurlitzer is a jukebox. It's a type of jukebox. And so the idea of the mighty Wurlitzer is Frank Wisner could sit in Langley, Virginia, the head of the CIA, press one button on his mighty Wurlitzer and have it play everywhere in the world in 50 different languages. That form of propagandistic synchronization leads to and breeds phenomena in which there's an ideological gestalt that's being pushed out by the capitalist ruling class and the communications industries and the culture industries that are working for them, that explain to people why it is that their lives suck. But they frame it in such a way that their reaction to that knowledge plays directly into the hands and the interests of the capitalist ruling class. And that's an enormous part of the mind management. You explain what's going on in such a way that people act in the best interest of the forces that are producing their own oppression and exploitation. Of course, there are other phenomena like the digitalization of the economy, the digitalization of the world, the fact that all of this is readily accessible, and other such things. But those are at least the immediate elements that I'd want to highlight. Nico, does that kind of speak to your point, or did you have other things in mind?
No, that's a good response to what I was thinking. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, just in the interest of time, it's a really rich conversation, and thank you so much for everyone who jumped in and shared your thoughts. I think that we're off to an excellent, excellent start, not in the sense that I'm self-congratulating myself, but because I can feel that there's a collective ethos in which people are really interested in connecting, sharing information, bringing in what they know, and facilitating a really organic and hopefully dynamic set of intellectual exchanges. We're going to wrap up here.